Last month, I reflected on the emerging research on the human capacity for violence and empathy. And I said that it's a question about the overall shape of our lives and of our society. It's a question of whether our societies and lives will be characterized by violence, relying on our capacities for coercion and aggression, or if they're going to be characterized by healthy social bonds, relying on our capacities for wisdom and compassion. Which action are we going to make exceptional, violence or empathy? And which actions are we going to make normal, violence or empathy? We can understand both of those paths as strategies to protect ourselves, to try to keep ourselves safe. And we can recognize that both possibilities live within us, but research, as I shared then, points that these are diverging paths. We nourish one path at the expense of the other. Each decision we make is something of a crossroads. We're answering the question, which direction do we choose? As an example of the kinds of tools and practices that can support that kind of personal and cultural transformation, I reflected on lovingkindness or meta-meditation and a 2008 study led by Barbara Fredrickson that investigated the impacts of that kind of meditation on participants. And just as a reminder, as we go further today with loving-kindness meditation, they documented slow and small changes that would build up both intrapersonal and interpersonal skills through awareness and cultivation of the daily, mundane experiences of love, joy, gratitude, contentment, hope, pride, interest, amusement, and awe. Significantly, the study demonstrated that having more positive emotions in themselves wasn't what made life more fulfilling. It was having that the greater positive emotions helped people build resources for living successfully. Turns out that when we work together to create conditions characterized by love, joy, gratitude, contentment, and the rest, we just have a much better chance of thriving. We have more energy to do the things that we love. We're not siphoning off that energy into things that make us more miserable. And loving kindness meditation is one tool we have to support that kind of thriving. The most popular form of this meditation practice is to bring the heart and mind to focus on a simple aspiration for well-being. Usually it starts with oneself, and then you move it outwards to people you love, to strangers, to people you find it more difficult to love, to all beings, and then back to yourself. There's a common formula that's used, and it's very simple. May I be filled with loving kindness. May I be well. May I be peaceful and at ease. May I be happy. And then, may you be well. May you be peaceful and at ease. May you be happy. Since 2008, studies have continued to show how beneficial that simple practice, so easily dismissed, can actually be. Emma Sipala, writing for Psychology Today, collected research on 18 different benefits of loving-kindness meditation that has been shown has evidence to show these kinds of improvements. They include some healing things that were unexpected, like decreasing migraines, helping manage chronic pain, helping manage PTSD symptoms, and even schizophrenia spectrum disorder symptoms. It helps with slowing aging. It helped improve social connections, such as making people more willing to be helpful to others, to be more compassionate, and to have more empathy, while it also decreased tendency toward bias and discrimination toward other people. More recently, loving-kindness practices have been increasingly designed to address specific areas of harm in need of healing and transformation, such as the Black Lives Matter meditation for healing racial trauma by Dr. Candace Nicole. And a 2022 study explored how loving-kindness meditation can help people navigate harmful situations, both individual stressors and larger systems of oppression. That study is especially important and relevant because it enlarges the focus beyond the individual who's practicing that kind of meditation to include our social context, such as the people I meditate with, the community that's supporting me, my social justice movements that I'm participating in, particularly those committed to racial justice, and to global systems of oppression that we're seeking to resist and transform. And the core commitment is to metta in the Pali language, variously translated as loving kindness or friendliness, or my particular preference, goodwill. When this goodwill encounters suffering, it arises as compassion. And when it encounters good fortune, including and maybe especially the good fortune of others, the fortune that might otherwise make you a little envious, it arises as joy. And when our goodwill is sustained by wisdom and insight, it arises as equanimity. Ajahn Sucitto, a Buddhist monastic and teacher in the Thai forest tradition, calls back to the Buddha's simile of a conch, that you would blow into and the sound would radiate out. He said these four qualities of kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity are called the measureless intent because their sound blows without restriction in every direction, to others as to oneself, to the heart that acted on those energies, and to any others who have been affected by them. He wrote that exactly what tune one plays is something that arises dependent on the distortion one is healing. There are pains that bring up the awareness of the basic need for the nourishing quality of kindness, whereas sometimes the awareness of how volatile and vulnerable we all are calls forth compassion, the protective energy. Sometimes it's the case whereby we recognize the harm that comes from neglecting what is good in ourselves and others, or even through taking others for granted. Then the sense in appreciating goodness, however obscured, can arise. It's important to not neglect this one, he writes. The stream of good deeds that you did do, the kind words that just seemed natural, but were the right thing at the right time. It's important not to overlook it, because we so often do. And equanimity holds the empathic space and allows things to unfold as they are right now. One of the reasons I mention these studies and applications is because of my own experience with loving kindness practices. It's been actually the center of my own practice for decades now. And exploring these different aspects of loving kindness is helpful in discerning what we are actually experiencing and empowering us to be intentional in our actions, to bring those things into our awareness so we can make decisions about them. Otherwise, they pass by unnoticed. And metta practice has been key in healing, transforming, and empowering me, both personally and in my participation in community outreach and social change movements. Beyond my own personal practice, I've often been invited to adapt loving kindness meditation to the well-being and aspirations of my LGBTQIA+ community. Similar to those applications of loving kindness meditation to healing racial trauma and navigating systems of oppression that I mentioned a moment ago, I found applying loving kindness to my experience as a queer person to be an essential part of my well-being and a joy to share with others. For example, as a member of the ACLU Missouri's Trans Leadership Table in 2020, I was invited to lead a guided meditation that adapted loving kindness to our particular experiences in the world. And we began by pausing and cultivating a sense of, quote, having arrived in this moment across sadness and incalculable loss, across joy and innumerable gifts, through the love and concern of yourself and others against oppression and hardship. And as a non-binary person whose existence has pretty much been up for debate, people don't care about my perspective. They've got it figured out on my behalf. So as a person whose existence has been up for debate and pretty much been erased through much of my life, this grounding in the here and now is healing for me and transformative for me. To recognize I'm actually here right now. Despite the numberless times that people and systems have communicated to me that I don't belong here or don't really know what I'm talking about or exist, that's deeply healing and connecting both to myself and to others. This kind of grounding helps us to center ourselves in our deepest aspirations, to get in touch with ourselves, pausing and opening up to those things that most lift up our hearts and animate and motivate our lives. How is it that we want to encounter this improbable and impermanent moment of time and space that we happen to inhabit right now against all odds? What opens our hearts and brings forth our love, our joy, our creativity, our fierceness? And in this example, I expanded that basic formula I shared earlier to include elements that are often stressors that our trans and gender expansive community faces. May I be safe. May I have food, shelter, and friendship. May I have health in my body. May I care for and appreciate my own body. May I honor my strength. May my heart be open and free. May my wounds, inner and outer, be healed. May I be generous, creative, and caring. May I receive the generosity, creativity, and care of others. May I be equal and free. And then we extend those aspirations toward others, eventually envisioning a transformed world that takes all of us up in that justice and joy, savoring and being nurtured by that kindness and our shared commitment to liberation and justice. And we close by resolving to let that energy carry and sustain the things that we needed to do, the tasks that lied ahead, embodying and co-creating a new world where all transgender and gender expansive folks could live with freedom, safety, and joy. That kind of meditation intentionally connects our well-being with our community and a future where everyone can live in abundance rather than scarcity. And I find that it energizes us and reminds us of how important it is to connect with our aspirations, ourselves, and each other, and then a vision where we no longer have to fight for our very right to exist. And that vision sustains us to keep going when otherwise we would be so easily burnt out or in despair and give up. Another related aspect to loving kindness practice is bringing attention to areas of our experience where we especially need to direct kindness, compassion, enjoyment, and equanimity. In the case of those of us who've experienced being alienated from our bodies, and I kind of suspect that's most of us, at least in the United States, but especially through discrimination and marginalization, cultivating loving kindness for our bodies is an essential and often overlooked practice. And this theme became the theme of a guided meditation I offered for a Transgender Day of Remembrance gathering with the focus on our bodies will be heard. In this practice, we began with awareness and appreciation of the courage and self-love it took just to believe in ourselves, to listen to, trust, and honor our own bodies. In the face of a society that told us we couldn't, shouldn't, or didn't exist, we dared to listen to ourselves, and our bodies told us, this is what this body is like. And we then paused and held the pain and suffering that we've had to carry in our bodies, the grief that's so often worn us down and worn us out. Yet, despite all this pain, our bodies have continued to carry the possibility of a different world. Breathing in of this body, breathing out, I listen to the life that's in this body. We then turned our attention to what our bodies teach us, and that our bodies can teach us what we need. We dream of a world where these bodies are safe, healthy, and rest easy at night. We dream of a world where we access medical care, housing, food, employment, and enjoyment that we need. We dream of a world where we get to decide what supports our well-being, not some dark money group somewhere else, but we get to decide, and where all of us can be free and equal. In this moment, anticipating a future that's built both by us and for us, we learn that we can relax into joy and peace. We learn that our bodies can be heard. So it's about making room for more than grief, It's making room for our fierceness, our pleasure, our love. Because when we are included, when everyone is included, when we stop marginalizing and oppressing even for a moment, our communities are stronger, more beautiful, and more complete. And learning that, we become more dedicated to making that what's normal. In this approach, loving kindness meditation is more oriented around our intentions and our aspirations than our emotions or our sentiments. At least for me, when I do loving kindness meditation, I'm not trying to coerce or manipulate my feelings. I'm not trying to produce a certain feeling toward anyone. I'm training my heart and mind to have a default toward kindness and justice after a lifetime of learning to survive in a world oriented around violence and oppression. In much of our lives, we're bombarded by messages that we are misunderstood at best and often unwelcome. Resolving to be here, to take up space in the world, is an expression of loving kindness toward ourselves. We exist in the face of all this injustice, this violence, hatred, and grief, and yet we can still insist on living, loving, and thriving. We can create new worlds that don't depend on those easy answers that society has trained us in toward coercion and violence. This new world can be born of kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. This point is especially important to me due to my own experience many years ago of being part of a meditation group. When I started sharing that my own practice was oriented around loving kindness, I was surprised by the response I got. I actually got teased quite a bit about it. The general idea was that loving kindness was too sentimental, that it wasn't real meditation like the insight practices they focused on. I also practiced insight meditation, and I had found that both of these practices were mutually supportive. I didn't understand their association of loving kindness with sentimentality because I didn't understand that they had learned about these practices in a completely different context than I had. My practice was born of deep suffering. It wasn't weak. It wasn't coercing my emotions. I was transforming aversion into goodwill. I was refusing to repeat unhealthy, coercive habits. I was resolving for my own body to be a place where suffering could come to an end, rather than incubating that pain and passing it on to others. Returning to Ajahn Sucitto, we get a better sense of how this comes to be and the connections there are between our kindness and equanimity. We learn to discern patterns based on our conditioning and the conditioning of others. He wrote, "In the world in general, there's a huge inheritance of abusive patterns based upon violence and deprivation, and who knows where all that began. But instead of blaming and agonizing, we can regard our own and other people's actions in terms of cause and effect. That regard is equanimity, the most reliable base for action." Equanimity is perhaps the most challenging quality to develop, though. It's still well worth our continued practice and effort. My understanding of Ajahn Sucitto's point that equanimity is the most reliable base for action is that it empowers us to act out of insight and understanding. Our brains are basically meaning-making machines, spinning out stories to help us explain why we feel the way we do and why we're justifying and doing what we do or what we want to do. Psychologically, what we most want is a convincing story, and we'd prefer to have it pretty quickly. Some of those stories may even become old standbys, providing easy answers for how to interpret difficult and complicated experiences. And too often, we can get caught in those stories that rely on praise and blame, that have the easy answer, "This is happening again," which is a thought that goes through my mind, and I suspect yours. The explanations might even hold some truth, but they're mainly convenient for us and convincing. Convenience is not a reliable base for action. This is part of the reason why when we begin a meditation practice, it's common for our minds to start unearthing all sorts of memories, from the ridiculous to the mortifying. This is part of getting to know our minds and our bodies and how we relate to suffering and the end of suffering. You might be enjoying your first taste of deep concentration. It's just pure bliss in one moment, only to find yourself singing the lyrics of some silly TV commercial you heard as a child in the next moment. During one extended time of sitting meditation many years ago, I found myself listening to a fractured playback of the entire Thriller album by Michael Jackson, pieced together of memories I'd made as an elementary school student. It was the first album I bought with my own money on vinyl. I was very proud of it. And those memories, those melodies had been hanging out there in my mind, undisturbed for decades, until my brain got desperate enough to fish it out and see if this would be the thing that would finally make me give up on sitting meditation and do something more interesting and useful. And it still makes me chuckle remembering that. But we can also encounter more difficult experiences, which is why we always recommend working with an experienced teacher, tradition, and community. And in cases of unresolved trauma or complex mental health issues, it's important to work with mental health caregivers. There are several aspects to meditation that can be disorienting and challenging, such as directly experiencing that what we often think of as a permanent, unchanging self is really just a dynamic process that is constantly adapting and changing. But anecdotally, in my years as a meditation teacher, the most common challenge is that we encounter those patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting and remembering that we find embarrassing, confusing, or even disturbing and scary. These are often key parts of our own stories of praise and blame, and they can be cruel, those things that have hidden in us for so long. In those moments, it's vitally important that we have the resources we need to respond to ourselves with kindness, patience, understanding, and wisdom. Several years ago, I was leading a workshop on cultivating self-compassion during conflict and stress, which is an important aspect of loving-kindness practice. And one of our participants was a retired human resources manager who was volunteering with a nonprofit. He had spent the morning looking rather disinterested, kind of staring off and having to bring himself back every now and then. So it didn't surprise me when he approached me at our first break, looking very serious. "This stuff just doesn't apply to me," he said. "I don't struggle with any of this, and I'm thinking that maybe I'll just leave." I was actually quite excited to meet someone who had already mastered the skills of self-compassion. So I enthusiastically celebrated his skillfulness, and I said, "That is fantastic," to his surprise. But then I said, I don't want you to feel like you have to stay if the training isn't benefiting you, but if you do stay, you could take the perspective that our reflections here might help you understand others, because a lot of us do struggle with having self-compassion. He thought about it a moment, made sense to him, and he settled into the morning with more interest. But all of that changed during our lunch break. The room's floor was tile over concrete, the perfect medium for shattering glass. And inevitably, we were cleaning up a mess pretty regularly in that training room. And on this day, this HR manager was the one who accidentally knocked his glass of water off a table, proving that gravity was still working after all this time. And as the glass hit the floor, in that moment of shared quiet after the shatter sound, when everyone turned to see what had happened, our affable HR man said to himself in the most savage tone I could imagine, "Stupid boy!" With our reflections on self-compassion fresh on his mind, he looked up and locked eyes with me. It was a look of mixed fear and wonder, like some lost secret had just been uttered. "I had no idea that voice was inside of me," he later told me. "It was my father's voice, plus 60 years of shame for every mistake I'd ever made." The afternoon took on new significance for him, and he came back for the follow-up trainings too. I don't doubt that some people have already developed these skills, even without formal training. But most people I meet have quite a ways to go. And we all need the encouragement, all the encouragement we can get to sustain these practices. All of us who are committed to continually growing into compassionate, wise people can benefit from having these skills and resources available to us so that we can be available to ourselves and others when we need that kind of wisdom and compassion the most. So, may we, ourselves, our communities, and our movements for justice be filled with loving kindness. May we work together so that all of us have the resources we need to take care of ourselves and to enjoy life. May we grow communities where justice is the norm, free of the cruelty of all forms of oppression. And may we finally and truly be happy. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.